Hey everybody, welcome to today's Wednesday workshop where we're going to be talking about the permissive conflict avoidant leader. Yes, we all have folks like this in our lives. I confess to struggling with this myself from time to time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dranitsaris-Hilliard and welcome so much. So excited to be coming to you here live, or if you're checking us out on our YouTube channel, to talk to you again this week all about permissive leadership with a particular focus on that conflict avoidant leader. You know, really looking at that cost of hating conflict that we hear from leaders all the time, and not really learning how to ever resolve it. You know, over the years, we have conducted through our business Caliber leadership systems many training sessions for leaders on conflict management or issue resolution. And by far, I would have to say the majority of our participants would agree that they hate conflict, right? And as we all know this, and as human beings, we rarely ever do anything that we hate. And so the unfortunate thing is that when leaders feel really strongly about conflict, they usually end up resorting to permissive or avoidant behaviors. And all that does is end up allowing the issues to fester, and it contributes to organizational dysfunction. So the fact is that conflict's normal, right? Whenever there are two people together, there is the potential for conflict. And often conflict is not so much about right and wrong, but just about differences, be it differences in our personality or our striving styles, our values, our needs, our interests. And so dealing with conflict dealing with conflict effectively is difficult for most leaders for the same reason that we always talk about and have been talking about for the last few weeks in these sessions about the permissive leader, right? Because they haven't been taught how to resolve differences. So fundamentally, they don't have the skills, they don't have the tools, they don't have the language even, right? To be able to really resolve differences in that more cooperative, non-aggressive way. Or they dislike the way conflict makes them feel, and so they end up avoiding conflict at all costs. So today's workshop is a little bit about how avoiding conflict has become the norm in leaders. This is all part of that movement towards more permissive leadership, and this avoidance of conflict goes hand in hand with permissive leadership. And there's a really significant cost. So we're going to talk a little bit about the cost of avoiding conflict to the organization, some of the things that we typically end up seeing, and again, how does that play out in real life in actual organizational context? And the other one that I just want to touch on, talking a little bit about kind of what is driving some of this conflict avoidance. And I know I hear it all the time from my clients, including at the executive level, is this underlying fear of upsetting or hurting the feelings of our employees that causes leaders to avoid the conflict. Okay? Now, why is this important and why does it matter? Why do we need to talk about conflict avoidant leaders or permissive leadership at all? Well, really, again, we come back to that thing about what is the cost? What's the impact? When we see conflict being avoided in organizations, there's all sorts of implications. And again, over time, it really does contribute to dysfunction in the organizations. And we end up having challenges in terms of attracting and not so much attracting, but retaining our staff, keeping them engaged. We see all sorts of morphings of behaviors. We end up having activities going on where we're not able to execute, we're not able to deliver or get to the outcome, or things take an incredible amount of time. I can think about a couple of my clients where they just keep avoiding the conflict, and so months go by, and every now and then they go back and they talk about it and they say we need to deal with it, but again, nothing ever happens and nothing ever changes, and the organization gets stuck, and fundamentally the people get stuck around it, and then they start to feel powerless to do anything about it, and then the complaining that goes hand in hand with permissive leadership emerges, or the blaming of others. And I think what's really challenging about this and why it's important to talk about conflict avoidance in leaders is that it is something that can be resolved By learning skills, right? So resolving conflict, being able to step in and resolve conflict is a skill, and we can develop that skill, we can learn it. But unfortunately, for most of our leaders, they've never had that kind of training, they've never had that kind of support. And so they go again, resort to the conflict avoidance and being in that permissive place. And part of the challenge and part of the journey we have for leaders is to really get them to stop hating conflict, to even stop thinking about everything as this conflict that's emotionally charged, and really that will allow them to stop abdicating responsibility for resolving it, right? So again, a lot of leaders, we see them working around conflicts, avoiding them, avoiding the individuals. I even have a client who will readily admit that if they can't get what they want by going through someone, they just work around them or they completely avoid that person. And so again, it plays out in a whole bunch of different ways. And the bottom line is it does contribute to some pretty significant dysfunction in organizations. So you want to be thinking about, and this is true for all leaders, and if you're dealing with a leader who is conflict avoidant, really helping them to learn the impact of this behavior, this permissive behavior of avoiding conflict on their reputation. Because nothing is worse for a leader than when people start talking about the fact that the leader doesn't have the ability to resolve issues or to resolve conflicts. And it's important, and I was actually talking to a client about this today, was this notion about separating the issues from the emotion, right? So depersonalizing, taking the emotion out of the conflict and really being able to just focus on what is the actual issue and how are we going to work to resolve the issue. And that the final piece around when we talk about it, and I'll leave you with some particular tips and strategies around this, but part of this is also getting to the place where you move into that habit of immediately addressing issues for the sake of the team, for the sake of the organization, for the sake of yourself. Because if you think about your own experiences, if you've ever had a situation come up, an issue or a conflict emerge, and you sort of put off a little bit, I'll deal with that tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and it's, I was really busy, I'll deal with it the next day. And the longer you put it off, the worse it actually becomes, right? Because now it's this thing that can't just be dealt with transactionally. It's now gone into a different place. And so we can then end up talking ourselves out of doing anything about it. So it's really important, as we think about some of these examples that I'm about to share with you, is again, really considering, how does this impact you? How does this impact your reputation? How can you start to look at issues and conflicts as normal and natural, but depersonalizing them, taking the emotion out of the conversation, and then moving towards that habit of immediately addressing the issues for your sake. So let's talk about some of the examples caused by avoiding conflict in organizations. I could go on and on with stories about this for a really long time, because again, normal, natural, we see it happen all the time, especially because the leaders we work with just have not had the opportunity to develop up develop up the skills they need to be able to resolve it. But I have one client right now that it's a particularly pronounced situation because they've been identifying it for months and months that there's an issue. There's been a lot of change within the organization, and there's new leaders running all of the core functions. And now these leaders have all been working together for years and years, but the division of responsibility has changed through a little bit of restructuring. And what's come up is where they all kind of work together really collaboratively in the past when they were in these different roles. Now with the changing in the roles, there's a little bit more of a power struggle that's going on. And one of the leaders is taking in a particular direction because he believes that's the right way to do it. He believes that's the direction it should go in. And the other leaders want to keep it more in the way that it was in the past. And it really doesn't matter what their position is on this matter. The fact is that the conflict keeps coming up and it keeps getting talked about. And they had identified the need to come together and to really look at decision-making and authority and essentially kind of how are we going to govern all of these interdependent functions that each one of them is leading. And so we all agree, yeah, this is a great idea. We've got the process all set up. We've got everything, sort of booked in. And then first one leader cancels. And then so the whole process gets bumped out. And then another leader cancels, and then the whole thing. And what's happening in the meantime at work is that the conflict keeps getting escalated because nobody's coming together in the room to deal with it. And they keep kicking it down the road to the point point where now it's so in such a state of frustration and dismay to a degree that it's like they don't even want to participate in a process coming in the room together, because the conflict has, again, it's festered because they just kept wanting to procrastinate and push it down the road and avoid it. And the sad part about that is, so it's playing out obviously in the workplace and in the interactions between people. It's affecting employee satisfaction and morale in a number of different ways, not to mention the added stress it's placing on the leaders. But it's and these are all resolvable issues. And that's the one thing that we always talk to our clients about is really looking at the actual issue, right? And really trying to get at and not about whether I like it or I don't like it, or I have a difference of perspective. That doesn't matter. It's about what's the process we're going to work through in order to resolve it, because it can be resolved through, again, the defining of it, the really separating out the emotion from the actual issue, and working our way through something a little bit more systematically. So again, skills that we need to work with. Now, some of the common reasons that leaders give us, and we've heard them all probably over the years, of not dealing with conflict. I mean, it's everything from, well, they should just figure it out and I'll leave it to my employees to sort it out, or I don't have time, or I'll deal with it at their performance review. And I understand, I appreciate just how time pressured most leaders and managers are. And so because of that, they avoid the conflict conversation because it feels like a lot of work. It just feels like it's too much on top of. And they end up rationalizing and convincing themselves that they don't have time, or that it'll work itself out, which of course that doesn't happen. And that only ends up leading to a greater negative impact on employees and the bottom line. And I've had a situation where, clients even going so far as to task the individuals involved in the conflict who are in a direct or in a peer relationship, to sort it out, as though somehow the folks that in other roles have the skill set that the leader that himself or herself doesn't have. And so again, part of the reason why we delegate off the resolution of the conflict is we don't know how to deal with it. But again, if the folks that are in the conflict had the skills to deal with it, they would have worked it through already. So it's also recognizing that when you're feeling that you don't know exactly what do I do and what do I say and what's my best approach, it's a really great opportunity to think about your own skill and what kind of coaching support might help you work your way through it. And one of the things that I know with a lot of our clients that when they're working to resolve conflict, especially newer conflict, is we spend a lot of time talking about the language and their use of language, what to say, what kinds of questions they can ask, how to frame things, how to preface things. So again, part of the scripting, because I know even for myself as someone who is admittedly a conflict avoidant individual by nature, and had to learn really to develop those skills, is that when I was first starting out, it was so helpful to have my business partner and be able to call my business partner up and say, what do I say? What are the words? Because once I could focus on, and I had the words and I wasn't having to focus on both the conflict and figuring out what to say, then it made it easier. And then over time, through practice, through repetition, developing the skills even further, learning more about issue resolution and conflict management, and then able to come up with the words myself, right? But again, it's thinking about what do we need as leaders in order to be able to do that. I have one of my clients where, and I think this is a really good example, they have a really serious situation in one of their functional areas, and they keep procrastinating having the conversation about it, for this reason or for that reason. And when I asked how long it's been going on for, the answer was probably more or less 9 years. So you see how long we can kick it down the road. So I'm like, okay, fine. Well, let's put a plan in place. Like, even if we're not having the conversation about some of the performance issues and the gaps, let's at least have the conversation to say, hey, this is what we are going to do. These are the steps that we are going to follow. We want to have a plan to resolve all of these particular functional issues by the end of January. A plan. We're not going to fix everything. We just want to have a plan. We want to all be on the same page with respect to it. And then comes in the, oh, well, we probably shouldn't have that conversation with them until the new year. And they're already saying they're going to come back after Christmas, in a better place, as though somehow everything's going to magically be different. And this is that conflict avoidance. And we're not even trying to get into the actual conflict or the performance feedback. It's more, hey, I want to do some joint planning with you. I believe there's some opportunities for us to strengthen the way the function performs. And this is the process that I'm laying out that I want us to participate in. And so again, even trying to move into something that, that difficulty that they have, and all of the reasons why we will talk ourselves out of doing anything about the conflict. So it's really important. Again, that's part of that permissive leadership, that conflict avoidant. So starting to recognize when you're rationalizing, or when you're talking yourself out of it, or you're putting the responsibility, abdicating the responsibility for resolving it onto someone else, as though, we don't have to lead. And I guess that's the most important thing, is we got to stop creating that vacuum. We create the vacuum around conflict. It's even worse and a bigger impact on the organization. Now, there are lots of ways that leaders can learn to resolve conflict. But most importantly, what we want them to do as they're learning to resolve the conflict is to find out that it's really not such a big deal, and that they can see immediately positive results. I've been working with a client for the last couple of months on this in particular, because when his need for harmony is so great that whenever someone had a different perspective from him, he would feel like it was this monumentous conflict situation, and he would either shut down or he would react. And so, because he didn't have the skills, he didn't know how to, one, tolerate that discord and get comfortable and accept that as a normal part of, sort of that, or how we operate inside of organizations. But secondly, he didn't know what to do or what to say or how to approach it. And so what he's learned is, first and foremost, is, to ask questions, to really understand what the other person is interested in. And to even if you do nothing else, just be curious first before, again, you go into your fight or flight response. And it's amazing that, I was just chatting with him the other day, and he was talking to me about some scenarios where he was doing that and how there was no conflict, because as soon as he asked the question and he could get more information, it actually took the stress of it. Whereas what would happen is someone would come in and express something or ask for something, and that to him would immediately put him in a conflict situation if he wanted to say or felt he should be saying no. And so instead, by going into, okay, tell me more about that. What exactly is it that you need, and when do you need it by, and how important it is, and actually engaging in dialogue around it, that feeling of conflict actually moved away. And so then it becomes, okay, I can do this. I can navigate this. I can find a way. Now, that's not to say he's still developing the skills, and we're still working on some other scenarios and situations for him to go and practice on it. But it's, again, he suddenly feels powerful just from that little bit of training, that little bit of coaching support, just getting him queued up in terms of how he talks. The other thing that he's really starting to become aware of is, in situations where conflict emerges, where there's more people around, he's being more observant of those who are doing it effectively and those who are not. And that's giving him more confidence in his ability to kind of practice some of these things and not second guess, can I say that or can't I say that? And so, again, really positive results really quickly. It does not take a lot. But one of the things that I know from my own experience and from my clients' experiences is, as we start to do these, as we start to navigate through these conflicts, we actually start to build our confidence around it. As our skills start to grow, it doesn't feel as uncomfortable, right? Because initially, when we have a development gap and we're stepping into it, there's a lot of discomfort, right? Our brain doesn't like us doing something new. And so we feel that discomfort, and we get so focused on the discomfort that we're feeling that we don't stay the course in terms of developing and practicing the skills and that we need for around conflict management. And so as we are doing it, and we're learning and we're practicing and we're being really intentional in these issue resolution situations, these conflict situations, however you want to frame it, again, that discomfort starts to go away, and we are able to do it with a greater sense of confidence and a greater sense of our own power and our greater sense of our own authority, which is what we're always trying to do with our permissive leader, our clients who are working out of the permissive leadership, is that really getting that sense of their own authority and their own ability to ask those questions, to, state their perspective and be part of the conversation around it, to hold people accountable, to set expectations, all of those things. Because again, that conflict avoidant can come up in all kinds of ways. And I know I've told this story before where, we have clients in leadership roles from the top of the house on down who believe that they do not have the right to set performance expectations, that would be insulting, that they can't tell their employees that, they have to do X or they have to do Y. And again, that really gets in the way. And because they see that as a conflict situation, even just setting expectations, forget about holding people accountable to them, but even that act of defining what's expected creates conflict for them. And so they don't do it. And then employees are operating within that vacuum, which is really frustrating, significant impact for the organization. So permissive leadership, as we've talked about in many of these sessions, and again, if you haven't had a chance to catch them, check out our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and we've got tons of content up there around permissive leadership. But permissive leadership has many, many different ways of presenting itself, and it is a developmental gap, okay? It's a developmental gap in the person that is leading, and allowing conflict to exist without resolving it is just one of many of the bad leadership habits that cause organizational dysfunction. And it needs to be approached as a systemic issue, not just focusing on the behavior of the leader, okay? So as with all dysfunctions, there needs to be clarity of what's expected and those supportive systems in place to align behavior. Now, often issues remain unresolved because leaders just don't have the tools. They don't have the tools to approach them in a way that ensures a successful outcome. And then fear of emotional or defensive responses from others will keep them from approaching conflict in a more transactional fashion, right? So we really do try and talk about, conflict, feedback, all of these pieces as transactions we want them to work through. It is the job of the leader, though, bottom line, to address performance, address behavior, address interpersonal issues as they arise. So choosing to address conflict as opposed to hating it and avoiding it actually saves money. It improves employee engagement, improves employee performance for sure, team effectiveness, and it provides emotional stability and security in that environment that fosters innovation and collaboration. So there's so many reasons why we need to, as leaders, develop up those skills to be able to resolve conflict, to get us out of the habit of avoiding it and being permissive and instead leading our way through it. While it does take more time and energy, okay? It takes more time and energy to delve into the sources of conflict. Ultimately, everyone benefits from taking the approach, okay? So what do we do? So what do we need to do as leaders? First and foremost, and really something for you to reflect on, or if you're working with someone who demonstrates this behavioral pattern, recognize why. Why are we being avoidant? What is it that's driving that? What is it that we are trying to protect ourselves from? What is it that we are afraid of, right? Because of course, fear is the biggest driver of behavior. So why? What is our particular reason? What is it that our needs, our interests that are in behind it? The second thing we have to do is we do have to face our fears, right? We have to face our fears, and we have to look at our fears more objectively, right? And not let them paralyze us or make us feel powerless, but really looking at, so if my fear is that, if I go into this conflict, they're not going to like me, or they're not going to, they're going to react in a particular way, or they're going to cry, like whatever that fear is, what do you need to do to face it? What do you need to do to move into that place of acceptance around it? Again, or just acknowledge that it's there, but don't allow it to be the driver of your behavior. And then last but not least, and this is so important because without this, we don't have the tools, right? Is you have to develop your conflict resolution skills. So that means really everything from understanding some approaches. There's some really, really great frameworks out there that make it easier, that give you a more systematic way of going about it while you're developing up your capability. It's like borrowing off of the expertise of others to be able to do it, learning some of these core communication skills like non-defensive communication and inquiry, like really critical things that help us to navigate the conflict. We teach our clients how to use issue resolution planners. So it's a way of preparing for that conflict conversation or that issue resolution conversation in a more structured and disciplined way. Think about language, okay? And again, that, as I said, working with, if you really struggle with this and you really find that it's getting in your way, working with a coach who can help you to, put together what it is you need to say, how you need to say it, how to make sure that you're as effective as you possibly can be in the conflict resolution process, okay? So, but again, with all of these, when we talk about permissive leadership, it's a developmental gap, right? And we're working towards closing these developmental gaps in organizations, in leaders, in order to break this pattern of permissive leadership that is really having a significant fallout in terms of employees and organization success. It is a core cause of dysfunction in organizations, because when we have a ton of folks who are working in permissive leadership, who are conflict avoidant, we're not getting to the resolution that we need. We're not coming together and actually making decisions and defining things. We talk about issues, we complain about issues, but it actually gets in the way of our ability to move the organization forward. And so again, we all get stuck in that dysfunction. So really encourage you to learn more. Interested in hearing some of your stories and what it is that is you're noticing in terms of those conflict avoidant leaders, or even if you're a conflict avoidant leader yourself, and some of the challenges. And I really encourage you to go after those three things. First and foremost, recognize why you're being avoidant. Why, when, are there certain situations versus others? Face your fears. What are they? What can you do? And again, to help you to manage so that those fears are not stopping you, and so that you can start to work through them, and then developing those skills, right? And what are some of the ways that you can do it? Tons of resources out there, tons of materials. But again, if you really find that this is a struggle for you, encourage you to think about coaching, even if it's just really, really targeted around this one particular area, okay? So the stronger our conflict resolution skills as leaders, the more we can move out of being conflict avoidant, and that will support us ultimately to learn how to lead with authority, which is our ultimate goal in order to increase our effectiveness as leaders and to eliminate dysfunction in our organizations. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining me. Check out some of our other videos over on our YouTube channel. Read more about the permissive leader in our book, So You Think You Can Lead. It was written, I think last year was when we had it come out at the beginning of last year. It was written because we were seeing such a pervasive shift towards this permissive leadership style. And again, in our organizations that we work with, really helping leaders to move through it and learn how to lead with authority was a priority for us, because as long as the leaders were practicing permissive leadership, it was really creating a ton of dysfunction in that organization. So really interesting read for you if you're a leader. If you're working in HR, this can really support you in some ways you frame your leadership development programs internally. And check out some of our programs and some of our offerings at Dranitsaris-Hilliard.com. With that, I'm going to wrap up. Enjoy, and again, stay tuned for more on permissive leadership, and also in the new year, we're going to be talking about autocratic leadership. So lots of fun and lots more topics to come. Always curious and interested to hear from you. So whether you're catching this live or on the replay, just pop me a note and let me know, or email us at info@caliberleadership.com. Thanks for joining.